Hey everyone, it's Lisa with Are You My Cousin? It's Thursday, so it's time for another weekly live to chat about genealogy. And as you can see, I have Mary Eberle with me today. Hey Mary, which means we're talking DNA, which is always a good topic for us to do because as you guys know, it is not my area of expertise, but it is Mary's area of expertise. So before we get into that, if you guys don't mind, if somebody will give me a thumbs up. Oh, perfect. Thank you, Lisa. Just to let me know that we're seeing you guys. So that's really helpful to us. Thank you so much. We were working on tech issues right up until literally the last minute before we started. So just wanted to make sure it all worked out. All right. So while you're coming in, again, I want to welcome you if it's your first time. We do show up here I show up here every Thursday to do a YouTube, Facebook live stream simultaneously. We talk about all topics genealogy-wise, and we're pretty casual around here. So if you have, questions as we go along, feel free to put them in the comment box. If for some reason we missed your question, just pop it in again. Sometimes they go through so fast if we have too many that we kind of miss them sometimes. So glad to, feel free to drop those in there for us to do that. As far as what's happening here at Are You My Cousin this week, the only thing that's I really want you to know about, and that is for those of you who are watching live, is that Trace, professional genealogist, is doing a special for Are You My Cousin readers, and so I'm going to pop that link. You would have gotten an email about it, and that goes through Sunday. I think that's the 18th. April 18th. So if you were watching this on replay, this may not apply to you because this will end on April 18th, 2021. So just wanted you guys to know that. But if you are watching it live and you want to check that out, feel free to do that. The link is in the comment section down below. And then the other thing is, guys, it's been kind of a little quiet around the Are You My Cousin? Lots of stuff going on behind the scenes. So doing a lot of kind of background tech work and stuff. So hoping to be able to have things running smoothly for you guys. So as you know, I'm a one-person tech show around here. So if something goes a little awry and disappears, wait a little bit and come back because it probably just means I'm working on it behind the scenes. And lastly, just so you know, guys, I will not have a Facebook Live next week. I'm actually attending a virtual conference. It is actually not a genealogy conference. It's a travel conference and I'll be working on some heritage travel things. So we will not have one next week. But anyway, I just wanted you guys to know that. So, hey guys, thank you so much. I'm glad you're here. Lisa said she found a Varian registries, maybe. Yay, wonderful. You've had some good success this week. I know, Lisa. Shelly says she recommends Trace. She just had some work done and was well worth it. Thank you so much, Shelly, for letting us know that. Yeah, these are good guys over there to work with too. So, okay, guys, we are going to talk about DNA. If you have not met my friend Mary Eberle, Mary is a DNA specialist. She is the creator and owner of DNA Hunters and the DNA Hunters Society, where she teaches the DNA concepts. So that might be something. I'll put the link for that here in the comments in just a second so you can find Mary. And Mary, tell us a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, because I'm really excited I was so excited when you brought this particular topic to me today.
Sure. Well, thank you, Lisa, and thanks everyone for joining us. Today, I was going to talk about the limitations of DNA. And in part, these spring from a presentation that I was asked to do recently. And people were very interested in knowing how far back in time DNA can help. And, just more about that. And I put together a brief presentation for today that addresses some of those issues. And, it's something I think is really important to understand, that DNA isn't always the silver bullet that's going to solve your mystery, but oftentimes it does. And it's part of the evidence that we assemble to figure out our family mysteries.
Mm-hmm. And that's what was so excited when you were talking about what the limitations are, because, I fully embrace DNA, but I fully embrace the paper research as well, because they do need to go hand in hand, as you and I have talked about. So, and I'm really not all that well versed in what are the specific limitations. So I am excited to do that. Are you ready for me to pop your slides up there, Mary?
Sure.
All right, let's see, make sure I did this right. Ta-da! Yes.
Yay. So, the question is, when can DNA help? And are we doing the next slide?
Oh, yes.
As in the old days? Okay.
Yeah, you can do it. You can do it from your end. Sorry, guys, we were really working hard on this one.
Okay. So if I screen share.
You're already sharing.
I am sharing.
If you just advance on your PowerPoint, you should be good.
Okay. Is that?
There we go. Yeah.
Good. Okay. So one question to ask yourself is who you're searching for. You might have a brick wall in your family tree and you want to figure out who was my second great grandparent or my third great grandparent, even a fourth or more distant grandparent. And I put together the top part of the slide to think about how many generations ago this person would be. The way I counted generations was to say my parents, that's one generation. My grandparents is 2 generations, and so on. So on the left, you can see that it would be 4 generations to get back to a second great grandparent. And we share our second great grandparents with our third cousins. For our third great grandparents, we share them with fourth cousins. And for fourth great grandparents, we would share those with our fifth cousins. Then when we think about how much DNA we would share with these third, fourth, and fifth cousins, we know that there's an average amount of DNA that is shared with these types of cousins. And the bottom portion of the slide shows that, for example, a third cousin on average would share 73 centimorgans with you. But there's also a range. And that range includes 0 centimorgans, where you're not sharing any DNA that's being detected on the test that we use. And it could be up to 234 centimorgans. So that's one limitation, that you might not be able to see some of your third cousins because you're sharing 0 centimorgans. Also, if you look from left to right, you can see that the fourth cousin amount of DNA overlaps with the third cousin overlaps with the fourth cousin, which overlaps with the fifth cousin. So each of these has an average along with the range, and the ranges overlap quite a bit. What that means is it might be hard to distinguish between a fourth cousin and a fifth cousin, in that the DNA alone and the amount that is shared doesn't really tell us how much DNA, it doesn't really tell us what the relationship is. So you might be able to rule out some things. So let's say you've got a match at about 200 centimorgans. Well, you can look here and see that it could be a third cousin or a closer cousin, but that would mean that it would not be a fourth cousin or a fifth cousin.
Okay.
So, we've got these ranges and these averages, and, it tells us something, but it gets difficult when you're out in this third and more distant cousin range to know exactly what the relationship is.
Yeah, I can definitely see that.
Yeah. So, so we've got these limitations. I'll talk about a couple more, but also when you're thinking about, is it a full third cousin, meaning you share both of those great grandparents, or just one, meaning you share one person out of the couple. So for example, we've got the third cousin versus this is third cousin once removed, but that also is the same amount of DNA for half third cousins.
Oh, good gracious.
Right? Because sometimes, our ancestors had multiple spouses. We're not exactly sure which spouse was our biological ancestor. And now we're trying to distinguish and say, well, that person and I share 60 centimorgans. Can I tell if it's a full third cousin or is it really a half?
So there is a question in the chat that might come up with this.
Sure.
We've got several coming up and we'll get to those. But this is about Y DNA. So if you want me to hold off on it, we can. It says, is it true that Y DNA can confirm a general paternal line, but not which of two brothers was the ancestor's father?
Yes.
Does that also apply to big Y 700?
I haven't worked very much with the big Y 700 test results, but I believe that that is also true.
Okay, so what that means, I want to make sure I understand. So you can have your Y DNA you can establish that paternal line, but if they're two brothers and you don't have necessarily the paper trail for it, it won't determine which of the two brothers it is.
Right, or even if you're just talking about Y DNA and looking at that alone, you might not be able to say if it's this man or his cousin or his second cousin. It's very, very limited in pinpointing the exact person that you're looking for. And then if you have Y DNA like what's in my family, because I tested my brother, he had 0 matches when we tested 67 markers.
Wow.
So, we're unique, right? And if we were looking for our direct, third great Eberle grandfather, that would really not help at all. And when you do the Y testing at Family Tree DNA, they do let you step down to a lower level of markers. So, I paid for 67. We got his results. It says 0 matches. And recently I went back in there and I stepped it down to 37, saying, okay, have any men who've done just 37 markers, do they match my brother? And there was one man, and he was a pretty distant match because there were probably 4 mismatches between the two.
Wow.
So they were only matching at 33 out of 37 positions. And the name was not Eberle. But when I did a Google search on his surname, it was very interesting because it said that surname was a place name, meaning it relates to where they come from. And they came from Southwest Germany. And that's where the Eberles come from.
Oh, interesting.
So, it's like, well, if I doubted that our dad was our dad or our grandfather was our grandfather, that kind of thing, this evidence, although not pointing to a specific person back in Germany,
right,
this is positive evidence that we've got the right people in the tree. Right? It's not
nice.
It's not saying like, oh, it's this Irish, Y DNA type, or it's this African or Asian or whatever. It's saying, geographically, you've got the right people.
That's okay. I see how you're using that now. Yeah, definitely. So Catherine, that she's who asked that question, that kind of talks to that, and you were right she's right in her thinking, definitely. So we've got,
right. Oh, I'm sorry. I was just going to say thank you for bringing up Y DNA, because I meant to include a slide on that and I did not.
That's all right. So then we've got a couple other questions, one involving endogamy and talking about aunts and uncles. I don't know if you want to keep going through your slides first, or if you want to go ahead and address those, which is easier for you.
Sure. Well, I can talk about endogamy.
Okay.
And that is another limitation. Endogamy is where people are related through multiple lines. And it results from having a closed community where people marry within that community over hundreds of years. And you can be, for example, a second cousin on one line and a third cousin on another line, and maybe a fourth cousin on yet another line, further back in your tree.
Mm-hmm.
And you're getting little pieces of DNA from each of those relationships. And then you're adding those together because the companies just tell you the total amount that's shared.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then you come over to a tool like the Shared Centimorgan project tool, where I'm showing you the numbers from that. And you've got a total amount shared, but this tool assumes that you're only related through one line.
Okay. Okay, so that makes sense. So if you are researching your family lines, and there is a lot of, the marriage within that closed society, for lack of a better term, over and over, DNA is less likely to help you, correct?
It makes things a lot more complicated.
Okay. So again, you've got to have some paperwork behind to understand what that limitation of that DNA would be for the endogamy.
Right.
That's it, right? Okay. So yeah. And then, so she also had another question. She said, can it show your ancestors' bloodline, including those who have Irish ancestors and have joined family DNA tree and have been given surnames because the individual who I created says we're not blood McLeans? All right, I lost. Do you need some clarification on that one? Because I think I got lost in that a little bit.
Yes.
So yeah, Lisa, can you clarify that a little bit? On what you're asking about the bloodline with it joining family tree DNA. I think you're talking about family tree DNA, but you have different surnames. I think is what has happened, is what she's asking about.
Okay.
So we'll wait. If you can give us a little clarification, but I'll let Mary go ahead and go further with her slides.
Okay. For the half versus the full cousin issue, there is something you can do with DNA. And I'm showing my tree to explain this concept. And if I was wondering if I come or descend from this full couple versus just one of them, one thing I can do is I can look for DNA matches who descend from this couple. So this is a great-grandparent couple, and these are great-greats.
Mm-hmm.
So I would be looking for third cousins who descend from one of Joseph's siblings and see if I've got those matches in my match list.
Okay.
Because that would say that Joseph is correct, or it would be evidence that I would put in the this supports Joseph category.
Mm-hmm.
And then if I wanted to know if his wife, Anna, is my biological ancestor, I could look and do the same thing. So I'm looking for people who descend from John and Maria, meaning one of Anna's siblings.
Mm-hmm.
And if I don't find any, that is evidence to say that Anna isn't my biological relative.
Okay.
So that, you'd put that into that evidence into that category of, here's evidence to say Anna's not your great grandmother.
Gotcha.
But there are limitations. So the limitations include, well, what if none of Anna's siblings had descendants who did DNA testing?
Okay.
Then they're not going to show up in my match list.
Mm-hmm.
You know, or maybe they are those third cousins that tested, but they're not matching me because about 10% of them don't.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so it's if I was doing this and I didn't see anyone from John and Maria, I would go back another generation and I would see, well, are there matches who descend one more generation back in time?
Mm-hmm.
Again, there are limitations, because if you descend from an endogamous population, or a really small pool of people, like early Europeans who came into the United States before it was the United States, well, you might have the same third great grandparents more than once in your tree.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, with all of this, we have to think about, what does this mean, but also what also could it mean? Like, there's not usually just one explanation.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Sort of. That makes sense. But I mean, it makes sense that I understand how that limitation is, and that, you know, because we didn't, you know, you just get little pieces when it's coming down. And if it's an endogamous society or family, then it's getting repeated a little bit, and you've got all the shared, you've got some shared relatives there that are really causing it to get a bit muddled. Hopefully there's a family Bible somewhere.
Right, right, exactly.
And match, and then we find the family Bible, and you got it all, right? So, oh my gosh.
Right.
So yeah. All right. So I was popping over to the questions. Lisa said, okay. So she said what we were about the bloodline. Yeah, she was wondering, I think, what it can happen, like when you're doing the Y-DNA, and we've talked about this, I know, in a previous one, you can end up with a different surname. Even though we know that we're following the male line back, that you can end up with a different surname. Because that was the question I brought to you, and I had a gentleman reach out who was a match for my dad, but didn't recognize any of the surnames that we had. And he matched, you know, relatively well on that Y-DNA type thing. But it was far enough back that I think, you know, there would have been some name changes, just shifts. And, you know, a lot of times somebody was talking to me recently about a name change, well, when the family came here, they changed the name. And I thought, you know, I think sometimes we make this assumption that when it comes to these names and we're trying to follow the surname with the DNA, that people change the name, and they didn't. Sometimes I like to think of it as more of it was just kind of a migration of the name. It wasn't necessarily, okay, we don't like this name, now we're going to be, you know, this name, or now we're going to spell it this way as opposed to this way. I really think it was just kind of a change that was probably, you know, that gradually can take place, you know, or in the event when, you know, family, you know, if there's a step family involved, so, you know, maybe there's a widow and a widower who marry, and the children might take the stepfather's name. I've had that come up, which is so I think sometimes we have this assumption they're changing names, and they're not necessarily changing names intentionally to throw us off. I think it's kind of a little bit of what's going on in society at that point. But that's, you know, so that's why you can get these Y-DNAs that are not the same surname. Am I correct in all that, Mary?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely. And especially with Irish people. And it's my understanding that people change their surnames to express their clan loyalty.
Okay. I'm not familiar with that. Yeah.
Okay. Or maybe this is Scottish, but I definitely, when I've looked at Y-DNA results from Irish people, I oftentimes see that their matches have, they will all be Irish names for the most part, right? But it'll be like Murphy and Green and Smith, and, you know, just a whole bunch of people with different Irish surnames are matching that male who tested, who is, Mr. Kincaid. And, and then you look at the results and you think, oh my gosh, what's going on here? And everyone will be relatively close matches, but it's because at some point in history, there was this changing of surnames that, ended up where a whole bunch of people changed their surname, and those people weren't biologically related.
Mm-hmm.
They were just being loyal. And then, the people who are your biological relatives, they might have changed to a different surname. And, it's just very, very messy. But at least you're seeing, well, we're Irish, that our family surname is Irish. Yes. And you might even be able to determine which county they came from. But, it's just not as clean cut as we would like.
Yeah, and I think that's a big thing with Irish research is as you said, if you can determine what county, even if the surname is changing, but you're trying to make that connection, it's crucial to know the county and the area in Ireland where ancestors came from, because without that, it's extremely difficult to make any progress back in Ireland for your research type thing. So definitely. Okie doke, keep on going.
Right.
I don't know how many slides you have. Actually, I never even asked.
Just a few more. I wanted to talk about what I have discovered with the help of DNA evidence. Mm-hmm. And of course, it was DNA evidence combined with non-DNA evidence. So starting with just one generation ago, I have found birth parents of adoptees and other people with unknown parents. Mm-hmm. I've also worked with quite a few people where their parent was the adoptee, and now the parent is deceased, and the children, who are adults, realize that maybe through DNA testing, they can find their birth grandparents, mm-hmm. meaning the biological parents of their adopted parent. It gets like all that terminology gets confusing, but that is a pretty common thing to do with DNA, those first two. And then with people who've had surprises through DNA testing, one person, her family matched 3 different people at a pretty close relationship, and she had never heard of these people. Wow. And through that, I found that she had a great-grandfather that nobody knew about. Ah. And then another one had a surprise ethnicity estimate. She had about 11% Ashkenazi Jewish heritage. Mm-hmm. And she was born and raised in London, and there was no known Jewish heritage in that family. And that's a significant amount of Ashkenazi Jewish heritage. And in the end, I found out that she had a Jewish great-grandfather. Yeah. So these surprises come up. And then with second great-grandparents, I have found different clients, second great-grandparents. The second one of those was really interesting because the client's husband, there was a story in his family that one of his great-grandmothers was a French orphan who was found during the California gold rush in the fields and was adopted by this Mexican family and then taken to Mexico and raised. So she said, is there any way you can find out if that's true? And when I looked at it, I found that her husband had these matches to people who were solely of French descent. The husband had no other known French heritage. And I found 2 sisters that appeared to be the mother. Well, one of them appeared to be the mother of this great-grandmother. Interesting. And from what we could see, it looked like one of them was much more likely to be the mother, mm-hmm. and that she probably wasn't deceased, but probably more or less abandoned the child.
Wow.
So, that was incredible, to say like, well, here's this really interesting DNA evidence, and there was non-DNA evidence. There were photographs of the bakery that the family owned in Paris and some immigration records. And she ended up finding this wonderful newspaper repository that somebody, I think, privately had that related to her ancestors. And, like, wow, this is pretty amazing.
Yeah.
So that's 4 generations ago. And going back 5 generations, I found my 3rd great grandfather. So I see that I left off the 3 on that last line. I found him. But then again, there's another 3rd great grandfather that I've been looking for, and I haven't found him.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And I wanted to put the caveat on that these are European and predominantly Western European situations. And that's who has done the vast majority of the DNA testing. That, who's in the databases? People of Western European descent. If somebody came to me and said, could you help me find my birth mother in Vietnam through DNA? Actually, I've had that question posed, and the answer was, I'm sorry, but I don't feel qualified. And I think it would just be really, really difficult, because you'd have to do a lot more upfront research and do directed testing if you could, and so on and so forth. So, and same thing for African Americans, that there aren't as many people in the database who've tested. And then also with slavery, we've got family trees that only go back, if you're lucky, into the mid 1800s.
Yeah.
And it makes it so hard that you really need a close match to put those pieces together.
You're right. And yeah, the Western European group tends to have, much higher numbers. Like you said, they're the ones who are testing. Definitely. Yeah, I can definitely see that. And you're right, because I actually had a friend of mine, and she's of Asian descent, and she's like, yeah, she said, I did it, but she's like, yeah, it was no fun. It all came up, China. That was it. She said, that's all I got, she said, and it was kind of this whole excitement about DNA, but then that was all. She said, there's just not enough people in the database right now. So she said, hopefully more people will, start to test and that kind of thing. So yeah, it was a little disappointing for sure.
Right. And the woman that asked me to help with the Vietnamese birth mother, her father was an African-American Vietnam vet.
Yeah.
So I could see some of her matches were Asian, presumably Vietnamese, but they were very distant matches. But it's more than what she had before she tested. So I think you just have to have the correct expectations going in. And with that case, we did find the birth father, and he knew about her birth mother. So, that kind of connecting the dots can work.
Yes.
But to just say
but it took both. It took not just DNA, but it took both.
Right. And all of these examples, that was the case, that, even where I worked, one of the very first people I helped was an adoptee who was born in Chicago, and she was born in the 50s. And I worked the case, and I said, okay, here's this man from Massachusetts. He's your birth father. And she was saying, how in the world is that possible? He has lived in Massachusetts, before I was born, when I was born, after I was born, like every single record has him in Massachusetts. And in that case, it was confirmed that was the birth father. But a couple of years later, in talking to her half niece, it turned out that he had spent a summer in Chicago visiting his aunt. And that was really nowhere in the paper records.
Right.
So sometimes these other pieces of evidence are the family stories.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So, it's just very, very interesting about what things can become evidence. The family stories, the Bibles. The Bibles might not record the biological father.
Yeah.
But at least you've got something, and you're amassing that evidence, and sorting through it to come up with a well-reasoned conclusion.
Yeah, and I think sometimes, like too, when you're really digging in, so if you've got the DNA, you're doing the paper genealogy, you're reaching out to pertinent people. I think all of us, when we get into the middle of a project like that, we're so tuned into that project that we start to recognize records. Maybe they may have been there for a while and we didn't recognize their significance to us, or they just, we start to just kind of, the more we dig in, the more records that seem to come our way, particularly in like the oral history type things. So yeah, definitely.
Right. So reaching out to your matches and having those conversations, and explaining, why you're knocking on their door. I had that happen recently where a woman, I reached out to her daughter because I thought her daughter was one of the DNA matches to my client. And the mother's initial reaction was like, what are you doing? And why did you contact my daughter and not me? And like, why in the world do you think this has anything to do with my family? And, I was like, okay. Like, sorry. Here's what happened. And, and in the end, the woman was super helpful. And like, once she knew what was going on, she was so helpful and so sweet. But it just, it's important to explain things, and, hopefully then people are willing to help out.
Yeah, especially in today's, it's hard to, you want to make sure they don't think you're crazy when you call them.
Right. And yes, that was really interesting. And, at first I was just kind of like, it took me a minute to compose myself and be like, okay, like, what does she want? She wants to know how this all happened and why. Like, I knew who she was because I had built a tree for her daughter. So, but I guess still I thought, well, it's just easy to reach out to this young person on Facebook and maybe they'll respond. And, she was the one that did the DNA testing. And if I let the cat out of the bag and tell her mother that, is that really the best thing? Is that the best thing? Like, I don't know. So anyway, do we have more questions?
So Lisa was kind of qualifying that she had a cousin in California that did DNA test with her dad, and she was Irish ancestors on both sides. Looks like the Y-DNA came up in the family tree DNA in the McLean family surname group, but not as a bloodline. They were actually McGoldricks. I don't know if I said that name correct. Yeah, so it definitely does. It goes back to what we were talking about with the surnames. I know in researching and extensively the White family out of Colonial, North Carolina, which is not for the faint of heart, guys. There's a lot of them. But when we did the DNA testing and we did multiple tests and things, and we turned out that we actually did not have the surname of White. We were the surname of Sweeney or McSweeney. So, but we actually did find the paperwork to go along with that indicated that Martha White was a widow, or Martha Sweeney was a widow, and she married into the White family, and the youngest children took the stepfather's last name, which is what we descended. So it was a really interesting round and round, but it was definitely both the DNA and the paperwork to do it, which is what Marie was saying down there. She said it does take both, definitely. you have to put all the clues together, all the pieces of the puzzle together, definitely.
Right.
So
that's very true. Well, I have a couple more slides to talk about one more limitation, if that is a good way to go. Otherwise, I'm happy to answer questions.
Yeah, I think that's it right now. So go ahead and.
Okay, sure. So another limitation, this is the last one I'll talk about, is when you're looking for an unknown parent or grandparent or further back in time, sometimes the DNA lets us narrow things down to a set of siblings. So let's say we're looking for an unknown grandfather, and now we've narrowed it down to a bunch of brothers.
Okay.
And then it's like, well, which one is it? And definitely at that point, I'm looking for non-DNA evidence and combining that with the DNA evidence, but I'm not always 100% sure on picking one of those people. So I've got one example. I think there are only 2 or 3 more slides. So one example where I was looking for what turned out to be a grandfather search, and I narrowed it down to a family which had 9 sons.
Oh my word.
Yes. So 9. With the DNA evidence that I had, I could rule out 2 of them because their descendants tested, and based on how much DNA was shared with those descendants, I knew that these first 2 could be ruled out. So that's good. And I won't go through all of the ways that I narrowed it down further. Well, one group involved that in the census record, I saw that the next set of brothers were in South Dakota at the time. So I thought, okay, well, we're going to put those into the least likely because this was a baby born in Wisconsin in 1913.
Okay.
And, people just didn't travel that much. They probably went to South Dakota and never came back. And I was looking at gravestones. From that, I could see that several of their children, including 3 of the sons, probably didn't marry, because they're in the family plot with their parents. And with these census records, with the baby being born in 1913, I was looking at where they would be in 1912.
Right.
So maybe 1910 census, maybe 1920 census, trying to figure out, where are they? And in the end, I had another 3 of them who lived with their parents. And I think 2 of those were buried with the parents. And, okay, so this is the South Dakota guys. I'm like, these are unlikely. And in the end, in the 1920 census, I found one of the sons who actually lived in the household where the baby was. So he was the farmhand who lived with the family.
Okay.
The little girl was 7 years old at this point. So, I guess the question is like, well, it's none of my business, of course, but how long has he been there?
Right.
I don't know, but I reported this to my client, and she had her uncle do the DNA testing also, and he remembered the family. And in the end, he shared with her this picture of the client's grandmother. So this would be his mom, standing at the farmhouse with his pony, and the pony was purchased by the farmhand.
Okay.
So, that to me said, okay, like not only is he living with them, he's buying a pony for the little girl, and, there's a very close relationship that they have.
Yeah.
So, we've got the 9. I can only for sure rule out the 2 who've had descendants testing.
Yeah.
But, beyond that, there are questions about, well, we could have people do DNA testing if they have descendants, but do we want to upset the family and say, guess what? We're related.
Yeah.
We're family. And, I think she was leaning toward not reaching out to the family, which, it's totally up to her. And, but it was very interesting how I had this huge group of brothers. One of them was a duplicate of another. So that, that one for sure was out, this guy. But, I would say that of the evidence that we had collected, that the most likely one was that one who is living in the home.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And you like you said, you did the old fashioned putting it both together. My thought when you said she had 9 sons, my first thought was that poor mother. Right,
and there were daughters too. There were
okay.
I think 3 or 4 daughters. So yes, I'll stop sharing. So
you can tell where my brain went. You're like 9 sons. I'm like, oh my God.
Right. It's
but if you're on a farm, that's probably a good thing. So.
Exactly. A farm in Southwest Wisconsin, an Irish Catholic family, where, I was raised Catholic, and big families, and
that's fun.
Just like, oh my gosh, that's like my worst nightmare, right? Like,
yes.
I want to see like 3 girls and 1 boy. Like, it's him. Yeah. I don't want to see 9 or 8.
Yeah, but you did a good job narrowing those down, definitely. So, well, thank you so much, Mary, for coming. I think sometimes we don't think about what the limitations are, and it can actually get quite complicated very quickly when it comes to realizing, is it telling you what it's telling you? And so, yeah, definitely expert help can be quite helpful with that. So do you want to tell folks about your DNA Society, Hunters Society, because they may think that they want to, somebody might be interested in learning a little bit more about some of the techniques that you do.
Sure. So the society is a group of people. We meet online and we do a live expert class. It's once a month right now. And then, but we're also doing Q&A sessions for 1 hour, and those are every week. And there's access to a video library with all of the presentations that all the expert presentations. And what I also really like is the fact that it's a community and people are really interested in helping each other. And one person's a retired archivist. So she's, has a great, knowledge base. She speaks Norwegian, so she knows about Norwegian genealogy. There's one woman who grew up in Belgium, so she just taught me that a lot of Catholics left Germany in the late 1800s because of religious persecution. Just really interesting to see like the different things that people bring to the group. And then there's some group solving of problems. So for example, one person, she's looking for her mother-in-law's father was an adoptee. So she's trying to figure out who the birth parents were. And it looks like she's got the birth father. So now we're looking for the birth mother.
Oh, okay.
And, it's just nice to hear, I've got ideas, but, I only know so much. And it's always nice to hear what other people's ideas are.
I agree. And I put the link to that in the comments again. So yeah, Catherine was saying she wishes there was some documentary evidence to use with her Y-DNA problem. So yeah, that can be difficult when you do the Y-DNA or any of the DNA, but you just lack, because sometimes records they didn't generate it, or they didn't survive, or for whatever reason, it definitely makes it a little bit of a challenge. Oh, June had a good comment. She said it takes a village. Yes, it takes a village to do genealogy research, definitely.
Definitely.
And that's how we learn. So anyway, so guys, thank you so much. Again, I will not be here next week. So don't think anything's happening, but I won't be here next week. And I'll remind you guys that in the newsletter that comes out on Monday. And but that'll give you a chance to catch up on any that you've missed. So I look forward to seeing you in the future. And Mary, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And
Thanks, it's great.
Expertise.
Oh, it's so nice to be here. Thank you. And thanks, everybody.
You're welcome. Bye-bye, guys.